Behind the closed doors of Langley, Virginia, urgent conversations are taking place. Intelligence analysts are poring over classified reports from across the African continent, and the picture they're painting has Western policymakers in full panic mode. The subject line on every briefing reads the same: critical threat assessment, African resource nationalism. What they're seeing terrifies them. From Burkina Faso to Mali, from Niger to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a new generation of African leaders is systematically dismantling 5 centuries of economic exploitation, and at the center of this continental revolution stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, visionary who has become the nightmare scenario that keeps Western intelligence officials awake at night. The briefings are classified, but the evidence is undeniable. African resource nationalism isn't coming. It's already here, and it's succeeding beyond anyone's wildest expectations. To understand why the CIA is in crisis mode, we need to examine what makes this moment different from every previous African independence movement. When Kwame Nkrumah spoke of African unity in the 1960s, he lacked the technological infrastructure to implement his vision. When Thomas Sankara revolutionized Burkina Faso in the 1980s, he operated in a bipolar world that limited his strategic options. Ibrahim Traoré inherited both their revolutionary spirit and something they never had: perfect timing in a multipolar world with unprecedented technological capabilities. Within months of taking power, Traoré achieved what Western economists insisted was impossible. He renegotiated Burkina Faso's gold mining contracts, increasing government revenue by over 300%. He expelled French military forces that had occupied his country for decades under the guise of counter-terrorism. Most significantly, he began building domestic gold refineries that would process Burkinabe gold on Burkinabe soil for the first time in modern history. These weren't just policy changes. They were surgical strikes against the entire architecture of neocolonial extraction. But here's what the CIA briefings reveal that mainstream media won't tell you. Traoré's success wasn't accidental. It was the result of meticulous strategic planning that combined military precision with economic sophistication and diplomatic brilliance. Intelligence analysts have identified what they're calling the Traoré Doctrine, a comprehensive approach to sovereignty that previous African leaders never mastered. First, secure domestic legitimacy through tangible improvements in people's lives. Second, diversify international partnerships to eliminate dependency on any single foreign power. Third, develop domestic capacity in strategic sectors before challenging foreign control. Fourth, coordinate with neighboring countries to amplify collective bargaining power. The results speak for themselves. Under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso has increased agricultural production by 40% through strategic irrigation projects. Literacy rates have climbed as education funding tripled. Most importantly, ordinary Burkinabe citizens can see their natural wealth being invested in their communities rather than flowing to corporate shareholders in Paris and London. This domestic success creates unshakable political legitimacy that makes Western pressure campaigns impossible. When people see their resources improving their lives rather than enriching foreign corporations, they don't just support their leadership, they become willing to defend it against external interference. But Traoré understood something even more sophisticated. Individual country success means nothing if neighboring nations remain under neocolonial control. That's why his next move sent shockwaves through Western intelligence communities. In September 2023, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter, creating the Alliance of Sahel States under Traoré's strategic leadership. Western media portrayed this as 3 military juntas forming an unstable partnership. The CIA briefings tell a very different story. Intelligence analysts describe the alliance as the most sophisticated geopolitical coalition in modern African history. These leaders coordinate mining policies to maximize collective bargaining power with multinational corporations. They share security intelligence that has decimated terrorist networks without requiring foreign military assistance. Most threateningly to Western interests, they're building integrated infrastructure that reduces dependence on traditional trade routes controlled by former colonial powers. The alliance's success is measurable. Combined gold production under sovereign control has increased by 250%. Cross-border trade within the alliance has doubled as they eliminate French-imposed bureaucratic barriers. Foreign terrorist incidents have declined by 60% as local security forces receive better intelligence coordination. This isn't three countries stumbling toward independence. This is strategic continental integration that demonstrates the power of authentic African unity. Here's where the story gets really interesting. The CIA briefings reveal something Western media desperately wants to hide. African resource nationalism is working because it's economically superior to neocolonial extraction. Take cobalt, essential for electric vehicle batteries. The Democratic Republic of Congo controls 70% of global reserves, yet Congolese workers earn less than $2 per day in mines that generate billions for foreign corporations. Now imagine if the Alliance of Sahel States model spreads to Central Africa. Imagine if African nations collectively demand that cobalt be processed into batteries on African soil before export. The global electric vehicle industry would face an immediate choice: pay fair prices for African labor and African processing, or watch their supply chains collapse entirely. This scenario isn't hypothetical. It's already beginning. Rwanda has started processing its own minerals instead of exporting raw materials. Ghana is building refineries for its gold production. Nigeria is demanding that oil companies invest in local processing facilities. Each success creates what intelligence analysts call the demonstration effect. When one African country successfully challenges extractive relationships, neighboring countries recognize similar possibilities for their own resources. But here's the factor that makes contemporary African resource nationalism unstoppable. Technology has fundamentally shifted global power dynamics in Africa's favor. Chinese satellite technology allows African governments to monitor their mining operations in real time, eliminating the information asymmetries that previously enabled corporate exploitation. Russian cybersecurity expertise helps African nations protect their financial systems from Western interference. Turkish drone technology provides African militaries with capabilities that reduce dependence on foreign training and equipment. Most importantly, social media platforms allow African leaders to communicate directly with global audiences, bypassing Western media gatekeepers who previously controlled narratives about African development. When Traoré addresses the United Nations, millions of Africans watch his speeches on YouTube and TikTok. They see a young, articulate leader who speaks multiple languages, understands complex economics, and articulates compelling visions for African development. This creates continental solidarity that transcends national boundaries. Western intelligence agencies understand that they're facing something unprecedented: technologically sophisticated African leadership with direct access to continental audiences and alternative international partnerships. The CIA briefings acknowledge that African resource nationalism operates within a transformed international system that multiplies its effectiveness. During the Cold War, African countries choosing independence faced binary options between American and Soviet patronage. Today's African leaders can choose from multiple international partners, comparing terms and selecting arrangements that best serve their national interests. China offers infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative without demanding political subordination or structural adjustment programs. Russia provides military cooperation and resource extraction partnerships without requiring democratic governance reforms. Turkey, India, and Brazil offer technology transfer agreements without conditioning aid on specific economic policies. This multipolar context means that Western threats to isolate African countries pursuing sovereignty become meaningless. When Mali expelled French forces, they immediately received Russian security assistance. When Niger terminated American military agreements, they enhanced partnerships with Chinese economic advisors. African leaders now possess something their predecessors never had: genuine alternatives to Western partnerships that come without conditions that compromise sovereignty. Intelligence assessments reveal that Western policymakers understand they're facing an existential challenge to arrangements that have defined global economics since colonization. Traditional tools of control, conditional aid, debt restructuring, diplomatic pressure, and military intervention have proven ineffective against leaders who enjoy genuine domestic support and diversified international partnerships. Sanctions against Burkina Faso would be meaningless when the country can trade through alternative partnerships with China, Russia, and Turkey. Diplomatic isolation is impossible when African countries represent the largest voting bloc in the United Nations. Military intervention becomes politically impossible when target countries possess modern defense capabilities and regional security alliances. Most terrifyingly for Western interests, successful African resource nationalism threatens to inspire similar movements worldwide. If African nations demonstrate that resource-rich countries can pursue independent development without Western approval, Latin American and Asian nations will inevitably follow similar strategies. The global implications extend beyond Africa to encompass the entire architecture of international economic relationships that have concentrated wealth in Western capitals while keeping resource-rich nations economically dependent. The CIA briefings conclude with recognition that African resource nationalism represents irreversible historical momentum. But what exactly would African victory look like? Imagine a continent where Congolese cobalt powers electric vehicles manufactured in Kinshasa factories by Congolese engineers, where Malian gold is refined in Bamako and stored in African sovereign wealth funds that finance continental infrastructure projects, where Nigerian oil fuels African petrochemical industries that produce plastics and fertilizers for African markets. This isn't utopian dreaming. It's strategic planning already being implemented by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who understand that genuine sovereignty requires controlling every stage of value creation, from extraction through processing to final market distribution. The Alliance of Sahel States represents the beginning of this transformation. Their success demonstrates that African countries with competent leadership, domestic legitimacy, and strategic coordination can achieve remarkable results in remarkably short periods. But continental transformation requires more than political leadership. It demands popular support from African populations who recognize that their resources should primarily benefit African communities. But the CIA briefings reveal even deeper concerns that go beyond immediate economic threats. Intelligence analysts have identified what they term cascading vulnerabilities that African resource nationalism exposes in Western strategic architecture. First, the currency warfare dimension. For decades, the CFA franc, controlled directly by the French treasury, has allowed France to maintain monetary colonialism over 14 African nations. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger signal their intention to abandon this system entirely, they threaten a mechanism that has transferred an estimated $40 billion annually from Africa to France. Intelligence assessments warn that CFA franc abandonment could trigger similar monetary independence movements across Francophone Africa, potentially collapsing French economic influence within a decade. The CIA's classified projections are stark. If the Alliance of Sahel States successfully establishes alternative currencies backed by their gold reserves, other African nations will follow immediately. Ghana's recent moves toward gold-backed currency, Nigeria's exploration of central bank digital currencies independent of dollar systems, and South Africa's promotion of BRICS payment mechanisms suggest continental momentum toward monetary sovereignty that Western central banks cannot control. Second, the military-industrial complex faces an existential crisis. American defense contractors have generated hundreds of billions from African military dependence. Training programs, equipment sales, maintenance contracts, and logistics support that kept African militaries technically subordinate to Western systems. Traoré's success with alternative military partnerships threatens this entire revenue stream. Intelligence analysts specifically highlight how rapidly African militaries are mastering non-Western defense technologies. Turkish drones have proven more effective against Sahel terrorism than expensive American counterparts. Russian training programs have produced African Special Forces units that outperform Western-trained equivalents. Chinese satellite systems provide African governments with surveillance capabilities that eliminate dependence on American intelligence sharing. The briefings warn that successful African military independence will inspire similar transitions in Latin America and Asia, potentially devastating Western defense industry profits that depend on global client-state relationships. Perhaps the most terrifying scenario in CIA projections involves African nations coordinating resource policies across multiple commodities simultaneously. Intelligence analysts have identified preliminary discussions about creating integrated resource management organizations that would function like OPEC for critical minerals essential to modern technology. Consider the strategic implications. African nations control 90% of global platinum production, 80% of chromium, 70% of cobalt, 60% of manganese, and vast reserves of lithium, uranium, and rare earth elements. If these countries coordinated pricing and export policies through continental resource cartels, they could effectively dictate terms to the entire global technology sector. The briefings reveal specific concerns about lithium cartels. As electric vehicle production explodes globally, lithium becomes as strategically important as oil. African lithium reserves in Zimbabwe, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo could supply global battery production for decades. If African leaders coordinate lithium policies with Latin American producers, they would control global electric vehicle development entirely. But the nightmare scenario extends beyond individual minerals to encompass comprehensive resource integration. Intelligence projections suggest that successful African resource nationalism could lead to continent-wide commodity coordination that would give African nations unprecedented leverage over global supply chains essential for renewable energy transitions, digital technologies, and advanced manufacturing. CIA briefings highlight another dimension of African resource nationalism that Western policymakers desperately want to suppress: infrastructure development that bypasses traditional Western-controlled systems entirely. Chinese Belt and Road investments in African ports, railways, and digital infrastructure create alternative trade networks that reduce African dependence on European shipping routes and American-controlled financial systems. The Libido Corridor, connecting Angolan ports to Congolese mining regions through Zambian railways, demonstrates how quickly Africa can redirect its resource flows away from traditional Western intermediaries. But intelligence analysts are particularly concerned about digital infrastructure that enables African countries to conduct international business without Western oversight. Chinese-built fiber optic networks, Russian cybersecurity systems, and indigenous African fintech platforms create parallel economic systems that Western intelligence agencies cannot monitor or control effectively. The briefings reveal specific alarm about African digital currency developments. Nigeria's Naira, South Africa's CBDC research, and the Alliance of Sahel States discussions about blockchain-based payment systems suggest that African countries are building financial infrastructure that could function independently of Western banking networks. These developments terrify Western intelligence because they eliminate traditional mechanisms of economic surveillance and control that have been essential tools of neocolonial management for decades. Intelligence assessments acknowledge Africa's most powerful long-term advantage: demographic transformation that fundamentally alters global power dynamics. By 2050, 1 in 4 human beings will be African. By 2100, Africa's population will exceed 4 billion people, more than China and India combined. This demographic explosion occurs precisely as African resource nationalism develops the economic and technological capabilities to support massive population growth. Intelligence projections suggest that successful African development could create the largest consumer market in human history, with purchasing power that rivals current Western economies. The strategic implications are staggering. African consumer markets that prioritize African-produced goods could become economically self-sustaining within decades. African university systems that produce millions of engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs could drive technological innovation that competes directly with Western research and development. Most threateningly to Western interests, African demographic growth combined with resource nationalism could create continental integration that makes Africa not just self-sufficient, but the dominant global economic force by the end of the century. CIA briefings acknowledge that Western attempts to limit African development become increasingly futile as African populations grow and African capabilities expand. The sheer scale of African human capital, combined with continental resource wealth and strategic political leadership creates momentum that Western influence cannot realistically reverse. Intelligence analysts have identified sophisticated African diplomatic strategies that exploit international legal frameworks to legitimize resource nationalism and isolate Western opposition. African nations represent the largest voting bloc in the United Nations General Assembly, and they're using this numerical advantage with unprecedented coordination and strategic purpose. The briefings reveal concern about African initiatives to reshape international law regarding resource sovereignty, indigenous rights, and reparations for colonial exploitation. These legal frameworks provide diplomatic cover for resource nationalist policies, while making Western opposition appear to violate international principles of self-determination and historical justice. African leaders are particularly skilled at framing resource nationalism in terms that Western governments struggle to oppose publicly. When Traoré speaks about food sovereignty and energy independence, he uses language that Western politicians employ domestically but cannot credibly deny to African nations without appearing hypocritical. The diplomatic strategy extends to international financial institutions where African countries are demanding fundamental reforms to World Bank and International Monetary Fund governance structures that have historically privileged Western interests. Coordinated African pressure for increased representation and alternative development financing threatens to undermine Western control over global economic policy making. Perhaps most importantly, CIA briefings acknowledge that African resource nationalism is winning the global information war through sophisticated communication strategies that Western propaganda cannot effectively counter. African leaders like Traoré communicate directly with global audiences through social media platforms, bypassing Western media gatekeepers who previously controlled narratives about African development. Their messages resonate internationally because they combine moral authority derived from historical injustice with practical demonstrations of successful governance that improve people's lives. Intelligence assessments reveal concern that Western media credibility regarding Africa has collapsed among global audiences who can access African perspectives directly through digital platforms. When Western journalists criticize African resource nationalism, global audiences can compare their claims with actual African voices and achievements, often concluding that Western coverage is biased or dishonest. This credibility collapse extends beyond media to encompass Western academic and policy institutions whose expertise on African development is increasingly questioned by audiences who can access African intellectual perspectives directly through online platforms. The briefings conclude that Western information dominance regarding African affairs is ending permanently, replaced by multipolar information environments where African voices compete successfully for global attention and support. Every view of this video, every like, every share contributes to amplifying African voices that Western media consistently ignores or distorts. When you engage with content that celebrates authentic African agency, you're participating in information warfare against narratives designed to justify continued exploitation. The success of African resource nationalism depends partly on global recognition that these movements represent legitimate self-determination rather than destabilizing radicalism. Your engagement helps build international solidarity with African people's righteous struggle for economic justice and political independence. Western intelligence agencies monitor social media engagement with pro-African content because they understand its strategic significance. Every subscription to channels like this one represents another person who refuses to accept Western narratives about African incapability or the inevitability of neocolonial relationships. If you believe that African resources should primarily benefit African people, slam that like button right now. If you support visionary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré who choose sovereignty over subordination, subscribe to this channel immediately and ring the notification bell. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand that contemporary African resource nationalism represents sophisticated strategic thinking rather than chaotic rebellion. Your engagement directly counters Western propaganda designed to delegitimize African agency and self-determination. The future of African sovereignty depends on global recognition that movements like the Alliance of Sahel States represent the inevitable result of centuries of struggle for dignity, justice, and economic independence. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions contribute to building the international support network that ensures African liberation movements can achieve their objectives. Subscribe now and join millions worldwide who recognize that African resource nationalism represents not just continental transformation, but global progress toward more equitable international relationships. Ring that notification bell and become part of the movement supporting authentic African leadership in determining the continent's destiny. Together, we can ensure that the CIA's worst nightmares become Africa's greatest victories, a continent of sovereign nations controlling their own resources, determining their own development strategies, and engaging with the world as equal partners rather than subordinate suppliers. The revolution is already underway. The question is whether you'll be part of amplifying African voices or allowing Western narratives to continue dominating global consciousness about the most significant geopolitical transformation of our era. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this message. The liberation of Africa depends on it.